what used to be the filler phase and what many people found kind of boring has become the focus of this expansion.
Demis are the filler now. How crazy is that?
Demis are the filler. So it's very cool to see.
Hello everyone and welcome to Akhmorning's Summoner Analysis for the Endwalker Job Actions trailer. Today we have our Summoner team here and we're going to go through the trailer footage, what Yoshida showed us through the demonstration, and our thoughts on each part of how Summoner is shaping up to be in the next expansion. I'm Nemec and I'm hosting this today, and if the rest of you could also introduce yourselves, please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Elevation.
Hi, I'm Idis.
Hello, I'm Hyder.
Hi, I'm Litsy.
Hey, I'm Spence.
And you may know of us through our previous Summoner work, whether it's on Akhmorning's site itself or from the times in the Balance. And we're very excited to discuss what we saw yesterday with the drop trailer and everything in the PLL. And so to start off, what we're going to do is we're going to watch the trailer together, and we're going to give our thoughts and reactions on what we think from what we've seen. So let's get started. Now that was certainly something, and from my perspective, very exciting to see just how Summoner had the longest of the previews of all of the 19 jobs for Endwalker. Sure, let's hear what you have to say for it, folks.
Definitely some interesting things shown there. One of the biggest takeaways is there were no dot actions that were ever seen in that trailer, and obviously the info that we have since that live letter was played is that dots no longer exist with the job at all. So that's really kind of changing the dynamic of what Summoner's going to be coming into this expansion, but also the way that they're kind of reworking some of the actions with the new Tri-Disaster being that kind of like a replacement to Outburst, and then having each of the Demi-Primal and those new Primal summons with the Garuda, Ifrit, and Titan also having their own versions of like single target and area of effect abilities.
Yeah, I really like that they unified the theme of Summoner. This seems like an almost complete rework as opposed to minor changes.
Basically, yeah, basically a new job as Yoshida was putting it. Sorry, Adis, go ahead.
Basically what I'd say.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the thematic shift of the job is, at least in my opinion, a pretty big win. and it seems like the days of sort of downtime spamming this Ruin 3 button we're shifting away from that a lot and kind of more into this mode of like actually using Aether from Primals and like having that as a bigger part of the rotation. And I think that's a pretty big thematic win for the job.
Sorry, go ahead, Spence.
I was gonna say that I like how the job, like, well, currently it has like a lot of different pieces that feel apart, like Dots and Aether with Fester and Aetherflow, and then you have your Demis, and then the Eggies. So now it's thematically we're cutting out some of that and replacing it with Primals and Demi. So that feels like the identity is becoming stronger.
And what are your thoughts, Hida, on what we've just seen?
I don't think I have anything like majorly to add there. Like thematically, it looks a lot cooler and feels more like a summoner than the Shadowbringer version did. But yeah,
definitely, it's a very interesting change or set of changes to say. The fact that we don't have Eggies anymore. And instead, we have the actual models of the Primals themselves. That's a very huge shift, thematically for sure, but also in terms of like the story behind Summoner, where we were just meant to summon small Eggies that were meant to be manifestations alike to the Primals, but now they pretty much look exactly the same as them because it's the same model.
It'll be interesting to see if they address that, because I know and this is kind of a tangent, but I know as they've shifted to like diminishing class and job lore in different ways, right? It doesn't really line up with what we've seen before. So it'll be interesting if they either retcon stuff or add stuff specific for it and Endwalker to explain that.
That's definitely true, because how we've learned things were and how it's looking now, it's very much a stark contrast. And granted, what we're seeing is a snapshot of Endwalker Summoner at level 90. We don't know how things will be leading up towards that, but just the whole fact that now, instead of having really weak looking Enkindle, suddenly these giant summons are doing really big and flashy attacks, which I know that definitely appeals to people who want to see more power out of the summons there. Definitely exciting changes, and the lack of dots, I know that's been a big attraction to Summoner for a lot of people over the time, but they have been phasing dots out from the game in general, in fact, where jobs used to have many dots, eventually some jobs had none. Summoner went from having many dots to suddenly just 2 to really manage. And then we lost Shadow Flare, and now we don't have any dots at all. And it is in favor of all of the damage coming from summons and summon-related Aether. And that's certainly an interesting paradigm shift for the job. So let's actually move on to how the actions are. So we'll start with the essentials and the basic actions that form the foundation of what Endwalker Summoner is going to be. So the first one that really we should touch on is our core filler spell for single target, and that would be Ruin 3. Now, we didn't see the Ruin 3 tooltip, but damage-wise, with the lack of dots, it might be that its potency has been increased. That's something that remains to be seen. And then, similarly, we do have an AoE GCD. Outburst is no longer a thing, and as Ellie mentioned, instead, we now have Tri-Disaster. So what used to be our bread and butter dot application ability for a very long time has now returned back full circle to its origins, where it's now Tri-Disaster as our AoE GCD, and it looks quite a bit different from how it used to, and we'll have to see if the design for Endwalker in general is that AoE favors 3+ targets, as it has done for Shadowbringers, as they did mention they wanted to continue the Shadowbringers design paradigm there. Do you guys have any thoughts on what we've seen so far with the base actions?
Yeah, I would say an important thing to note, this is a major change, is that Ruin 3 and Tri-Disaster are kind of the unaspected and presumably weaker versions of the skills we are granted from our summons. So at any point in time, Summoner has a single target or AoE skill to use. That's either aspected, or if you have nothing, use the unaspected ones, Ruin 3 and Try Disaster.
I think the Ruin 3 change also really caught most of us off guard. Because if you look at the job trailer or watch the demonstration as well from later in the live letter, the Ruin 3 cast time has been reduced to basically model what the Malefic change was made a while back with Astrologian, where now when you cast Ruin 3, it has this sort of 1.5 second cast time, which gives you a leave window while waiting for the remainder of your GCD recast to finish. And it really surprised me because when you look back at Summoner just across basically every expansion, and especially with Shadowbringers, this is a job that always had a lot of mobility just kind of baked into its kit. With Shadowbringers especially, you had so many instant cast options between Eggy Assaults and your Dreadworm and Firebird Trance, providing you instant cast GCDs because of the 2.5 second cast reduction, which was provided by the Trance. Ruin 4s, and then even if you didn't have any of those actions, you still had Ruin 2 to fall back on, which was technically a potency loss, but it was still an instant cast GCD option that was available to you. So it's simply surprising that, given how much mobility this job already has, and then also when we touch later on the Demi-Summons and the new Primals that are coming with Endwalker, that they're willing to give the job even more mobility now by allowing Ruin 3 to have that shortened cast timing and giving you a little bit more time to either slide cast through the GCD or just like be able to weave off GCDs essentially on demand is what that change is going to allow you to do.
Yeah, I would say that Summoner, or the new Summoner, looks like it has almost as much mobility as range physical DPS, actually.
Outside of a few specific pastime spells, like the Ifrit ones, which we'll talk about later, there really is almost no casting in full rotation.
It's interesting that, we've definitely all caught on the mobility aspect, and certainly later on in the live letter, Yoshida was talking about how part of Summoner's charm now is its identity in just how mobile it is as a caster. And granted, whilst we had seen that in the design and very clearly in Shadowbringers with just how many actions and were instant, or the option to just Ruin 2 hero if we wanted to hear that coming from Yoshida himself and say, yes, this is actually an intended part of the charm of the job now, I was a bit surprised to hear that confirmed. It wasn't something I was necessarily expecting, because in some ways we have kind of deviated more away from being a caster, because yes, we're casting spells, but most of them are instant. We have drifted further away from a job that has more hard casts, as opposed to, say, Black Mage, which is primarily hard cast based, and Red Mage being the one in between. It's definitely interesting to have heard that from them now, but it's interesting to see the 1.5 second change and having that for mobility, but also for weaving and OGCD. Like, every potential GCD is just a weave space now. For instance, we have Energy Drain, and I guess we should move on towards the OGCDs that we have as the base action. So Energy Drain is now on a 60-second cooldown. It still provides 2 Aether Flow stacks, so the number of Aether Flow stacks for Energy Drain hasn't changed, but because the cooldown's doubled from 30 to 60, we're only going to have 2 Aether Flow actions per minute instead of 4. So that's certainly a change from Shadowbringers. But the other addition with Energy Drain is that it now provides on use the Ruin 4 ready status, and by that, every minute we'll have access to Ruin 4, as opposed to it being generated from Eggy Assaults or RNG through pet actions as it has in the past. So Ruin 4 itself is a 430 potency AoE action, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's kind of interesting. The buff itself lasts for a minute, so we have a good amount of time to plan out when we want that Ruin 4 to be, whether it's for, strong buff windows, or whether it's for cleave, because it doesn't have fall off. And that's surprising to me for an expansion where every ability with AoE that we really had pretty much had fall off, every major one at least. It's definitely interesting to see that path taken with Ruin 4. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I think this is, to me, the most bizarre and weirdest part of the design that they've showed off. Kind of tying in with what we've talked about with the amount of instances we've had. These are really Energy Drain, Ruin 4, and then our Ether Flow Spenders, which are Fester and Pain Flare, which haven't really changed. And then a few smattering of other things are only real off global cooldowns. And since it's been extended the cooldown of Energy Drain so much, we have drastically fewer of them. So it seems very odd to give us these many instances and not much space to really use them with. And beyond that, it just seems weird to make it so long. I don't really know why they would choose to do that as opposed to keeping it at 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would say Ruin 4 is almost like an appendix feature where it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the kit. It's just kind of a leftover from the past, and we don't want to get rid of this really cool animation we made for Ruin 4, so we have to include it somewhere.
Well, they made a new animation for it because it's AoE. Now,
that's true, actually, but it's still mostly the same.
It's just interesting to me that they would change Ruin 4 in this way, and then when combined with the Energy Drain cooldown, essentially becoming where you're only using Ruin 4 once every minute. And to me, that just feels a bit odd, because when you look at how Ruin 4 has existed in the past, but also when you just look at like every other job, and as their sort of base actions increase over time, right? Like if you think about Black Mage with Fire 2, and then they get Fire 3 and Fire 4, those later stages of their fire actions are like a core aspect of their rotation. They're using those actions all the time. And that's kind of the same with like other jobs, like with healers, with Stone 3, Stone 4, Malefic 3, Malefic 4, etc. Like each of those like upgraded actions becomes kind of like the focal point of their filler GCD, and it's really odd to see now Ruin 4. And granted, Ruin 3 and Ruin 4 both existed separately. Where Ruin 4 was more of like an upgraded Ruin 2, and Ruin 3 just existed as the upgraded Ruin 1 from the past. But it's interesting that to have the strongest Ruin action become such a like minimized feature within the job rotation now, that you're only using this spell once a minute and that's it. Compared to, with Shadowbringers, we had the choice of using Ruin 4s exactly where we wanted to and producing those procs exactly where we wanted to. And so you were generating 8 procs every 2 minutes, and in Stormblood, the Ruin 4 procs were RNG, but you were still generating several Ruin 4s every rotation cycle just through the RNG percent chance from your pet actions. So it still felt like the Ruin 4s had more of like an impact on your rotation as a whole. And again, to see this change where you're only using it once, it feels very odd, to say the least.
Also tying in with that, the amount of ruins in general we're casting is a lot lower, and so it feels like this weird like mix where they don't want to get rid of it, but at the same time, by introducing all of these primals to what was previously our filler spam ruin phase, they're removing all that time that we're spent casting it. And so it's like, okay, well, why do we still have it? They can't give us that many, because if they give us so many, we're literally never casting Ruin 3, right? But then giving us only one sounds like, well, what's the point? So I'm not really sure what their idea was they had in mind.
Yeah. I was thinking like with Bahamut having like all instant cast too, like it's just a difference. We're saving 3 to 4 for our Bahamut windows. We don't even need to do that anymore. And then Ruin 2 being gone completely. You're using Ruin 4 now to avoid those usages, and with it gone, it's just like the major point of it is the 2 major points of it are gone. Like it doesn't fit.
I would say it almost makes more sense as maybe an off GCD, because we don't have that many off GCDs to use anymore. But a lot of wave based, we have a lot of instants.
it'd be kind of interesting, like energy drain, basically giving us two different off-global resources. You know, I think it would definitely make more sense as an off-global than as a GCD as it does now. And it's kind of like, what's the difference between that and Esper, right?
I would definitely say like the biggest surprise, in addition to what you've all expressed with the Ruin 4 change, is I still can't believe that the Ruin 4 ready status is a minute, because I mean that matches the cooldown of energy drain, and it's saying, yeah, you can bank this, or you can use it immediately, or you can use it like whenever it makes sense to, but it does provide opportunities where you could effectively have them almost back to back, where you would have, because it's a very strong potency action at 430 potency. That's one on the higher end of the GCDs that we have, and obviously AoE. So, like in theory, you could have like a Ruin 4, Energy Drain, Ruin 4 situation, and if there's a lot of targets, then that's quite a bit of AoE burst.
The same is true of the Aether Flow too. You could bank like 2 Festers or Pain Flares from before and have 4 back to back. So you could be in a situation where you have like a 2-minute burst window or something.
Yeah.
And the recast for Fester and Pain Flare is 3 seconds instead of what it is now 5. So it's easier to fit in those 2 stacks within a shorter period of time before you need to energy drain.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting change. Part of me is kind of surprised that they wanted to keep it to just the 2 Aether Flow stacks for energy drain use. I mean, it's still a bit weird to me that we are having fewer energy drain actions than like Scholar, for example. I was kind of banking that maybe we would eventually see an increase to the number of Aether Flow gems per like energy drain use. So not seeing like 3 or maybe even 4, like I don't know. I'm not sure what their design idea was in mind for Aether Flow actions in general, but not seeing that is definitely a bit jarring to me given the history of the job. But then again, the job is rebuilt continuously, so nothing should really be a surprise anymore. So speaking of the Aether Flow actions, we know that Festa and Pain Flare are present. Nothing really special to say about that other than Festa being the burst when you have dots. Now there are no dots, so what are we bursting anymore? Now Festa's just like a vanilla damage OGCD. We'll have to see like how strong it is, but yeah, nothing really interesting to say about Festa other than yes, there's no dots to worry about, so no whiffing or having reduced potency with nothing active. And then you have, trusty Pain Flare, where if again they're going towards the paradigm of 3+ targets for AoE, then maybe that's our 3+ target AoE option for Aether Flow still. Or maybe it'll work at 2 targets, like who knows. We will need to see final potency confirmations on release, because it's worth also mentioning things can and will change, not only from the demonstration, but also the Media Tool build to launch. Tooltips can and will be wrong, and they can also change, as well as the actual potencies involved. So that's... oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to comment on Fester, like with the removal of dots. One of the weaknesses Summoner has had this tier and previous tier with Shiva was like having to dot in order to use Fester on ads that need to die quickly. So having that restriction or that weakness removed is something that could be helpful for those situations without having to lose damage.
Yeah, previously you would just throw a Pain Flare that was stronger than using a Fester.
An unbuff Fester, yeah.
Which always felt pretty bad, but...
Thankfully no Fester ruins, because that was especially miserable in that scenario, like Titan jails. Oof. No, that is a very good point, and certainly for the case of ads dying quickly, it's a favorable change, for sure. So, moving on to the next OGCDs that we have now. These ones are brand new, kind of. The Endwalker, and specifically they pertain to when we have our carbuncles out. So these are carbuncle eggy assaults, I guess you could call them. Where the first one that we have is Protection of Light. And Protection of Light is replacing effectively Titan's Earthen Armor that we have currently, where it's a 60-second cooldown action with 2 charges, and it gives us for 30 seconds a 20% max HP shield. Now, compared to Earthen Armor currently, this is a downgrade in terms of how much mitigation we're getting over time, where the cooldown is twice as long, and instead of 30% max HP as current, it's 20%. However, this is still a very strong ability to have, and it's also an OGCD now as opposed to being a GCD, and that is an important distinction too. But the thing that I'm keeping in mind is this is effectively free to use every minute. And being a charged action, it's not a case of like drift is going to be an issue for uses. There'll always potentially be a good time to have that shield up just to reduce the damage that we're taking.
So it is worth mentioning that, similar to how Titan's Earthen Armor works now, you can't cast this when you have a Demi. You don't have a Carbuncle on the field. So
Very true, but you do need Carbuncle to be present. And this also applies to when, we'll touch on this more later, but when we're also summoning the elemental primals, that Carbuncle does despawn, and then we wait a bit, and then Carbuncle respawns. There is also a bit of dead time with that, where Carbuncle isn't present, where we can't use Carbuncle's actions because it's not there. And so we do have like these little pockets where it's Carbuncle unfriendly for these actions, but we have a lot of time like outside of those where the windows are viable. And additionally, this is effectively the devotion replacement. The other Carbuncle action is Searing Light, and Searing Light is a 3% party damage up for 30 seconds, I believe. I need to double check the tooltip. But
Yeah, from the demonstration.
that's really long for a party buff. I don't think we've had 30-second long party buffs in forever.
Hypercharge from Machinist was the last one.
Balance, right? Or like all the old Astro cards from Heavensward.
the old
Yeah.
Astro cards, yeah.
Old Astro cards, it's been that long. So,
Well, Machinist and Stormblood hypercharged because of its kind of resetting, the way that it can reset the duration a little bit. That also could last up to 30 seconds, and then I guess you technically had Foe Requiem as well back then with Bard.
Use
Yeah,
those
it's been quite a
Aethers.
while.
Yeah.
Oh, this one isn't quite as strong as, say, the Requiem's 3%. It's still pretty good.
yeah.
In Stormblood, Foe was 3%.
Oh, I was thinking of the Heavensward version.
Yeah. So it's basically the same as like Foe Requiem from Stormblood. It is very interesting to see the 30-second duration though, because like they said, it's been a long time since we've ever seen a raid buff have that long duration, and over the past few expansions, they even specified and they recognized how strong party synergy was with overlapping party buffs with each other and really abusing the multiplicative nature of those buffs, and that they wanted to reduce that, and they openly said this multiple times throughout the past few years of wanting to reduce how strong that synergy is. And so I think for a lot of people, we were just always expecting that raid buffs would be made weaker and weaker over time, since like that's just like the easiest way to remove that synergy in the first place. And yeah, to kind of see this where it's not like a direct percent buff, but like extending the duration is still it still makes a buff stronger in a sense that you're getting more uptime with a percent damage boost compared to before. So it's definitely interesting to see like what Square Enix is planning to do in that regard, because we haven't seen any other party buffs from the live letter other than Reapers, and we know that Reapers is 20 seconds currently.
Mm-hmm.
So we've discussed it before and kind of theorized, like, are they perhaps planning on making buffs lower percent damage buff, but having the durations extended? Like that might be something that they're attempting to do.
It falls in line with their paradigm choice of where, to quote the old quote, the extreme DPS disparity, where from Heavensward into Stormblood, they wanted to effectively reduce the problem of people who are good at aligning in buff windows versus people that aren't, because it was quite a big disparity of good stuff in buff versus not having good stuff in buffs. Quite a big gap. And see them effectively reducing amounts but making them last longer, it does effectively help better for sustain, and it does alleviate that problem with, hyper-optimized burst windows. I mean, you'll still want to optimize, of course, but in terms of like the relative gap, it is going to be a much closer situation than what it has been in the past. And it will be interesting to see how this holds up for the buffs from other jobs as well, like you said. We've only seen Reapers, and there's certainly many more buffs to compare against.
It's possible they've also given Summoner a longer duration because of the restrictions on using it. Like, we can't use it in a demi, for example. So, like, it's possible they may have, since we do have to use it before our burst, that has caused awkward issues in Shadowbringers at times with, like, fitting all of our stuff in our own raid buff. So it's possible they may have had that in mind. I don't know. Also, another thing I don't think was mentioned that's a buff with this ability is they changed it from 3 minutes to 2 minutes. So.
Oh, that is true. That is very, very true. 2-minute cooldown.
Yeah, and they made it a point in the live letter that they were changing a lot of abilities to coincide with 60-second or 2-minute timings. So I assume that this was part of that, or a part of their reasoning for making Searing Light a 2-minute CD now was to be in line with that new approach that they're taking.
I think one of the most interesting things is because it lasts so long, we can get the full abilities of one Primal Ender and maybe even the start of the next one for the, I guess you could say, Eggy Primals.
Yeah,
It's really interesting to see like exactly how everything lays out. Sorry, go ahead, Spence.
Oh, I was thinking like if other jobs buffs were extended to maybe 20 or 30 seconds like ours, then I think back in Heaven's Word, potions used to be 15 seconds, right? And then they extended that to 30. And then I think like with the additions they're adding to rotations, like you can just fit more into like a longer buff window, and that's like it's helping.
I can definitely see that helping, as mentioned, to kind of close the gap, so to speak. Speaking of gaps, but in a different sense, so one of the things that has been a problem in the past with Devotion, especially in arenas that have been large, is Devotion's range and not hitting people. Now, what's interesting in this case is because the carbuncle isn't focused on attacking the boss and is trailing after us constantly, effectively the buff is almost centered from us. So our location is going to matter in terms of making sure the party is covered, rather than having to think, where is my Eggy, like in terms of relative to the party? Is Devotion going to hit everyone? Obviously Searing Light now. That's just a point that I thought about, where now, as long as we're in a sensible place to catch people, it should always catch everyone. But worth keeping in mind as well that if we're in Narnia for mechanics, then there's a chance, especially in larger arenas, that we will miss people.
I could see that being an issue because of the restriction with demis, and like it always, like our demis will always be on like a 60-second timer, so having the Searing Light right before that, like if we're at a point where you have to choose between going into your demi and not using your buff to hit everyone and waste your personal damage, or you delay your demi and then to make sure it hits everyone if you're out of range.
Yeah. So 2 more points with base actions, but we have been talking quite a bit about these, and there's a lot more still to cover. Resurrection and Physic. Now, the dev team did mention that they were quite torn over whether Resurrection should still remain as part of the Arcanist/Summoner kit. They opted for it to remain. We can expand more upon like Resurrection's impact in Endwalker Summoner in a later point. Physic remaining is also surprising. If it's still using Mind, then it's still very much a worthless action. Well, not entirely worthless, but it's something you're expected to never cast. And sure, our HP is lower, and we'll be hearing more relative of the max HP with the squish. But however, if it's using Intelligence to scale, then Physic actually becomes surprisingly potent. And we don't know if that's the case or not because it wasn't used. But that's a point we can touch on in one of the later items. So I'm going to move us along to one of the major items, and that is the Demi-Summons and the trance situation. And what's effectively changing? So the rotation cycle is starting off, at least at level 90, with you summon Bahamut, and as Bahamut is around, you're in a Bahamut trance, you're in Dreadworm trance. And so they've effectively tied together the ideas of Summon Bahamut and Dreadworm trance into one thing. They've also done this with Phoenix and Firebird trance, where in the tooltips it shows that when you summon Phoenix, when you summon Bahamut, you're in their respective trances. So let's talk about what's actually changing when we're in Summon Bahamut and Summon Phoenix. So with Summon Bahamut, first thing to notice is we do have Death Flare as a separate action, and it's something we can only use once given the length of its cooldown. And we also have Enkindle Bahamut, and that appears to be on an 8-second cooldown. Alright, in the demo footage, whilst the tooltip says that the summons are 20 seconds long, in the demonstration footage they are 15 seconds. So this is a case of the tooltips potentially being old from Shadowbringers, and maybe 15 is the intended final amount, or maybe that will change. That's something that remains to be seen. And lastly, there are 2 GCDs that are changing. Ruin 3 is transforming into Astral Impulse, and Tri-Disaster is transforming into Astral Flare. And we saw Astral Impulse used by Yoshida in the demo, but we haven't seen the tooltip nor the animation outside of the trailer for Astral Flare itself. So I wonder how you guys feel about the summon and trance changes. I guess there's also the auto attack side with Wormmace and Scarlet Flames to also touch on.
I would say it's, I suppose, a natural evolution to have Dreadworm Trance and Bahamut combined. Because even with Shadowbringers, Phoenix and Firebird were tied together, right? But Dreadworm Trance and Bahamut still existed as these separate, sort of distinct phases. So I guess just to be consistent with things, tying those two together finally, it just kind of makes sense with the way that Phoenix had already existed throughout this last expansion. The Astral Impulse and Astral Flare actions, and this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier, that they seem to be really pushing this approach of having very distinct single target and AoE actions like through each of your like distinct phases with the job now. That you're always going to have this GCD for your single target damage and this GCD for AoE damage. And it's, I mean, I'm not sure how like other people like that change. I suppose it does simplify things and makes it easier to understand, especially for like a new player coming in, to have it laid out like that simply. But yeah, other than that, the 15-second duration, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because with the past 2 expansions with Bahamut, most players who have played those expansions and played this job then would know what Bahamut rotations were like, and the whole approach of trying to maximize the amount of worm waves you got through each Bahamut duration and doing these very specific rotations in order to accomplish that. And now that, at least from what we can see in the job trailer, the moment you cast a GCD and Bahamut casts that first worm wave, it starts to attack automatically after that point, which is giving the impression that maybe the worm waves now will just be an automatic process, sort of like, I guess similar to like Rook Turret from Machinist, where you know, once you start using an action, it's gonna handle itself automatically from that point going forward. So maybe the player will no longer be required to actually proc the worm waves consecutively. It kind of takes that player aspect out of it. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then yeah, the whole tooltip being 20 seconds, but in the demonstration we see it as 15. I would assume that's just a tooltip error. if it comes out that it's actually 20 seconds, I'm not sure how that would fit with some of the other aspects of the kit that are coming as well, but I guess we'll just have to see.
I'll say I'm personally maybe a bit disappointed that they removed the Phoenix 1-2 combo, but in return, I do think that the Phoenix utility, they showcased a new move that we believe functions a bit similarly to XCOG on Scholar, where when you put it on a target, after the target drops below a certain HP threshold, or when the effect expires, it grants a pretty strong regen effect.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that'll be quite nice for Prog, and it's free, so you could always use it.
Right, so to talk a bit more about Fiber Trance, Summon Phoenix, as it's now known. So when you enter Summon Phoenix, a couple of things happen. So you still get Everlasting Flight, and it's still a appreciable regen for the party. Your Ruin 3 transforms into Fountain of Fire, that remains the same, and your Outburst equivalent Tri-Disaster becomes Brand of Purgatory. Now, as Adis mentioned, the 1-2 combo of Fountain into Brand doesn't exist anymore, and as Ellie said, instead there's this distinction of GCDs for AoE and GCDs for single target. So instead of having the implicit cleave from Brand, but also for single target instead, for single target we'll be using Fountain, 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 and for AoE, Brand, Brand, Brand. The GCDs are separate. You're not getting Hellish Conduit from Fountain anymore, so they're not dependent in that way. And also, as Adis mentioned, there's the additional action. Now, this one shares the same slot as Death Flare, and by translating it, it's Flames of Rebirth, so it's a very Phoenix-themed action, and the status description does give the implication that it's going to work like Scholar's XCOG, where either damage or when it fades, that it applies a stronger regen. Now, when we look at the healing numbers, it's about 2 and a bit times stronger than the heal over time from Everlasting Flight. Now, what we don't know right now is whether this is necessarily a targeted action, or whether it's party-wide. And if it's party-wide, that's quite interesting from like a healing perspective, because we have time in the Fiber Trance to... We don't have to activate it right away because of the cooldown and also the single use in that sense. We could plan for it to be before like a raid-wide or something like that, and then the buff applies, the raid-wide happens, then the regen kicks in. That's something healers might like to know more about, and I'm definitely curious about that from like a party level, for sure. One thing to mention with Phoenix is, because of Everlasting Flight, and our belief has been that Everlasting Flight is the cause for why Phoenix can be a bit of a bird brain for Scarlet Flames. Now, if we do something like summon Phoenix into an immediate revelation, that's going to be a really, really long time before Phoenix will start doing its Scarlet Flames. And it might be that we want to stagger revelations in to be a little bit after the first Scarlet Flame has started. Kind of like how we have to do it now because we're forced to, just to make sure that we do get enough Scarlet Flames happening in total. So that whilst the rotations for demis has kind of been reduced to something a lot more simplified, there is that consideration to think about with Phoenix, and it might come into play, it might change. That's something we'll have to see. We'll definitely be playtesting that. But also on a related note, the tooltips do say that Bahamut and Phoenix will attack their target with Worm Waves and Scarlet Flames. It doesn't mention being tied to the GCD, and the trailer does show that it seems to be automatic because the second and fourth actions for each demi were happening without a GCD associated with them. And in order to target and begin that auto cycle, it's very likely that we're going to have to always damage first or do a detrimental action first, just so that the pet homes in and they're like, yeah, I've got to attack this target now. Because from Yoshida's footage, he summoned Phoenix, and even though he had aggro on the striking dummy, Phoenix didn't do anything at all to the striking dummy for about the bulk of the summon Phoenix window. So that's definitely something that we're going to have to keep in mind as we play. So let's move on to the next item, and this is perhaps one of the more exciting changes as well, is our level 90 Capstone abilities. And looking at the tooltips, our Capstone abilities are Summon Garuda 2, Summon Ifrit 2, and Summon Titan 2. And these are what are manifesting the actual elemental primal models, as we've seen in the footage and in the trailer. Now, those actions themselves are at present listed as 700 potency damage actions that also provide various other benefits depending on which one is chosen. And the Enkindles, well, they're kind of like Enkindles as we used to have them, but the damage portion of these does not apply any dots. So, as mentioned, dots no longer are a thing for Summoner. And what do you guys think about what we've seen so far with the Capstone abilities?
Well, they definitely feel and look a lot more epic compared to the old Eggies that you had with the previous system. To actually see those boss models reused, and they spawn and they cast their big ultimate ability. Visually, it looks so much better than just having like a miniature little like Garuda there, just like spitting wind blades at a target. So I really like it. Like from a visual standpoint, it's great, and from the actions that we saw, like it definitely seems to have a huge impact on the way this job is going to be with Endwalker. They certainly seem to have taken the approach that like they want these primals to be the new, like that new approach, that they want the job to revolve around using these primals repeatedly. And I guess like kind of playing to like the lore of like what a summoner is supposed to be, right? Like you want to be like summoning things and not just standing there with one pet out and just like casting GCDs. It's like now it's like you're summoning big primals, you're using primal actions repeatedly. So I would assume most people definitely would like that change.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely. This is, I mean, at least thematically, it's been what I've been wanting from the job kind of from the start. Like, it always felt so disjointed before this. So I like the direction they chose, and I think that if nothing else, it looks really cool.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see that what used to be the filler phase and what many people found kind of boring has become the focus of this expansion.
Demis are the filler now. How crazy is that?
Demis are the filler. So it's very cool to see.
And it's not even just like the primals that look great, like the updated Ruin 3 and I guess Try Disaster AoE GCD, like those animations look really nice too, and so it's like nice to look at.
It's definitely an audio-visual feast, and so the actions themselves, Garuda is using Aerial Blast, Ifrit is using Inferno, although from the Japanese it is Hellfire, so whether it's Hellfire or Inferno, probably Inferno, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. And then Titans is Earth and Fury, and not only are the models like much more epic, but the actual AoEs themselves are huge. They're way bigger than what we've had for like Enkindle in the past used to be absolutely tiny, and it was barely a blip on the radar in terms of damage and how it looked. But now you have Garuda out, she casts Aerial Blast, and she does her scream. It's like, oh, suddenly Featherfall. That's something like really cool to see from the summoner side for the theme, and definitely something I've been wanting to see for a long time. Now, relating to the damage of these actions, something that's not necessarily as apparent, but it's something we gleaned upon from the footage from the demo, is that the time from using the summon action and the time until the damage text appears, the floating text, is about 4 seconds. And a question then would be like, when is the snapshot for this action? Is it fairly early on versus when we use it, or is it just before like the damage appears? That's something to test and figure out, just to make sense for like a rotation perspective, because if depending on when that snapshot is, we'll have to either plan more, definitely something to think about, but also, is the damage coming from us, or is it from the pet and thus pet scaled? So that also comes into play with regards to the snapshotting, because if it's coming from the Garuda entity or the Ifrit entity or the Titan entity, then as a pet command, is there going to be a delay in when the damage is confirmed? Definitely something we'll have to playtest and figure out. So something that Spence touched on is the action changes. So there is a single target and an AoE target action associated with each of the elemental primals. So after we use a Demi, it grants us mysteries of Ruby, Topaz, and Emerald. So the core carbuncle grammars that we have, and that is what enables us to summon these elemental primals in the first place. Now, we have two actions that one we haven't seen on Yoshida's hotbar, but we know exists, and the other that is Gem Shine, which is the single target action. And that's the one that's missing, because there have been people saying, what is this action we're seeing in the trailer that we don't see Yoshida demonstrate? And it's because Gem Shine isn't on his hotbars in the first place. So he never actually showed us and used that one. Whether that was deliberate or an oversight, remains to be seen. But the one that he did show was Gem Brilliance, and that's the one with like the triangle-looking AoEs, and these are 2.8 second base cast time actions, so they're quite long. Yoshida did mention that these elemental gem actions are meant to be stronger than your base actions, quite strong. And so we've seen how the potency for Ifrits, for example, as the main one that we saw, is 180 potency per target. It's a longer cast, and then it acts as like a combo enabler where when you resolve it, you're then given Crimson Cyclone, which is the dash attack to an enemy, and then when you've used that, it combos into Cyclone Strike, which is a melee range target action. And this is the one where the summoner's punching into the ground. And I think, holy crap, summoner has a gap closer now. That was definitely a surprise. And again, it's kind of crazy to think about in terms of mobility. Additionally, we have with Garuda as one of the more previously AoE-centric pets. The moment you summon Garuda, you're granted Slipstream Ready buff. This lets you cast Slipstream, which is on the GCD. It is a 2.8 second cast spell, and it provides the ground AoE as we're familiar with. But an important point is that it grants us, the player, the Slipstream buff, which means we don't have to deal with any nonsense where the pet despawns and the Slipstream despawns. As long as we're alive, the Slipstream will stay around and tick until it fades. Additionally, while we don't know the single target ones for any of the elemental states, the AoE version for Garuda is known as Emerald Catastrophe. So all of the AoE ones are something Catastrophe. Emerald Catastrophe, Ruby Catastrophe, Topaz Catastrophe. And one of the distinctions we noticed with the Garuda one is the fact that as an AoE, it has a ridiculously fast recast time. It's instant, but its recast time appears to be around 1.2 seconds. Now, how is that possible when 1.5 is usually the floor? There are some exceptions that can be coded into the game, and it appears that that's the case here. So, in the span of 2 normal GCDs, we'll have used all 4 of Garuda's AoE charges, which is quite potent from a burst AoE perspective. Additionally, with the other elemental primal, so let's talk about Titan. Titan has a very interesting one where there's the Catastrophe for AoE, and then into the clap, the wall clap ability, which is Mountain Buster. And that's kind of like the 1-2 combo that we had with Phoenix, but now in Titan space instead. And the damage from this looks to be really potent, and it remains to be seen whether the whether the single target is instant, but it's definitely interesting to see the damage unfold for Titan.
I believe the clap is off GCD.
Right.
Yeah, it kind of behaves like a mini Gnashing Fang or something from Gunbreaker, where you get like an OGCD after you hit the GCD, and presumably it goes away if you hit a different GCD, although we don't know that for sure.
Yeah, there's some irony that Titan might be or it seems to be at this point, one of the higher single target damage primals. So going from the tank primal to the big single target damage one is really funny to me.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting seeing that. And as said, we have no idea of the damage or like how the single target versions of how gem shine actions work, but we can assume that, for example, with Ifrits at least, we know that that's 80 potency per target. And if they're adhering to the 3+ target paradigm for when you want to use single target versus AoE, then we can say, okay, the action has to be the single target action has to be more damage than 2 targets, but less than 3. So it could be anywhere between more than 360 and less than 540. 400, 450, 500, anything like that is within realms of possibility. Now, they did say the actions were powerful, so 500 would be nice, Yoshida. It's definitely exciting to see how that damage will play out. One thing they did touch on was that these elemental primals are not required to be cast in a strict order. That means you can pick and choose based on the situation and based on like mobility needs. For example, Garuda's maybe is really good for mobility phases, although it's short because all the stacks will be gone fairly quickly. Or Titan with the melee dash, like if you're out of range and suddenly there's a donut attack, a dynamo, and you need to go into the boss's hitbox, instead of having to sprint, you can just jump in. That's an option we never had before. So I wonder what you all think about the option of being able to use them for different purposes at different times.
Oh, it's definitely good. I think everyone would agree that having that flexibility is just a good thing. If we didn't have that flexibility, I would actually consider that a mistake, just from a design perspective. And I think it's just thematically like kind of cool to have like different things that can have different strengths, so to speak, right? Like having one that is very strong for a specific purpose compared to another, because like you said, we can always we can choose which Egu we might want to use for the situation. Maybe Garuda is strong in instant cast, or maybe for AoE purposes. Maybe Ifrit has really good single target damage, but it's tied to these 2 very long path bars with GCDs, and then it has this sort of melee combo, like the dash and then that pile driver kind of animation on the second one. So it's like Ifrit does a lot of damage, but you're tied to these very specific animations in order to use those actions in the first place, whereas the other ones are much more free to use. So I think it's a good thing that they have these sort of different interactions. I do think by the time we get the full game and people can have the time to figure things out, that there will probably be like a specific order that we generally want to follow just for damage optimization purposes. But the possibility of having flexibility, it's always a good thing.
Yeah, adding on to that, I think this type of flexibility rewards foresight and planning, which is really good. And I should correct myself from before, where Titan does look like it does. Titan's off GCDs do look very strong, the clap, but all these numbers are subject to change. The numbers seem a little bit weird in the version that YoshiP was demoing. So we'll have to see.
That could just be a media tour thing, though, as well. Like we've always seen in previous media tours, numbers that don't really make sense, and a lot of that is either they just haven't finalized the tooltip, or they're just going through like finalizing balance changes and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
I do like how distinct the 3 are too. They seem like they will play very differently from each other. So even though they're relatively short, I like that they have left some distinctions between them and how you're going to play with them.
Yeah, they're not just like carbon copies of one another, where like Phoenix and Bahamut as like Demi-Summons were basically the same with Revelations and Akhmorning, where the only differences was like the GCDs used, but it was still like, yeah, it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, if you compare like Bahamut and Phoenix now, the only difference between them, practically speaking, is that you cast Deathflare on Bahamut and you get heals in Phoenix.
Right.
Other than that, they function literally the same.
Right, that's true.
So it's a little, boring, I guess I would say.
Filler demis.
I don't know if boring is the right word, but it's a little uninspired that they're not different from each other. Whereas the Primals all, like, you actually do have to play them differently, and they interact with your situation differently.
And even this should have been mentioned earlier, but the elemental primals themselves, whilst Titan and Garuda provide you with 4 stacks for using their Gem Shine and Gem Brilliance actions, Ifrit only gives you 2. So what does that mean in terms of like the final potencies or the expectation with Ifrit? Because you're getting half as much from like the Ifrit elemental fire state in terms of potential action uses, but the fact that you have that melee combo, the animation for Crimson Strike, it's entirely possible that that's actually a target AoE, but you have to be in melee range because it leaves a little circle. Maybe it's single target only, maybe it's also with cleave. Like, that's something that's really interesting to think about. It's just saying they're all very distinct, and I'm really excited to the prospect of being able to adapt and adjust on the fly with the different aspects. Like, a job to have that level of flexibility is almost unheard of from DPS these days. So as a new reimagining of Summoner, I think it's really cool. It might be really confusing and overwhelming for people who are like, oh god, which primal do I summon here? Like, why? And we can, establish the general order, so to speak, but I also think it will be cool for people to discover and be like, hey, there's this mechanic, like I said, a dynamo happening. Maybe I should be an Ifrit and plan to use Ifrit at this point. Or, again, Garuda mobility, or we don't know with Titan. I think that's all really interesting. And definitely something to look forward to. Now, we've talked about, well, there's one other aspect we really should touch on, just quickly. Role actions for casters for Endwalker. So we still have Lucid Dreaming, and that's functioning the same. We still have Swiftcast, and assuming that's functioning the same. And we have Surecast, again, functioning the same as we have known them now, where they retain their cooldown. Swiftcast makes your next GCD instant, has 60-second cooldown. Surecast, anti-knockback and anti-spell interrupt on 2-minute cooldown. But then we have a Sneak Edition, which used to be Black Mage only, and that's with Sleep. And that might not seem like impressive or anything, but it's quite surprising because Sleep's really useful in content like Eureka, Boja, and even Deep Dungeons. And I know Deep Dungeon crowd are very excited to see Sleep on Red Mage and Summoner to supplement their kits.
It's a pretty big deal for Deep Dungeons, especially, and especially with the removal in Shadowbringers of a lot of easy to access CC abilities, like for example, Heather on Red Mage being removed. For Deep Dungeons especially, it's pretty cool that we have access to it.
Yeah, and if that stays, I think that's pretty huge. So enjoy, Angelus and Maggie and co, because I definitely can see you guys having way more fun with being able to control situations with Sleep. So definitely, and little shout out, Deep Dungeon guide section soon, TM.
I'm definitely curious, what their plan is for Sleep. Like, is it just to allow the casters to have something for, that older content, or do they actually plan on utilizing this more going forward?
Well, they did make Repose a healer role action, and we didn't see any instances in content, aside from, Eureka and Boja, etc., where they could use it and it was needed. Well, not even needed, it's just helpful to have. But, I mean, it's entirely possible. Maybe we'll do some crowd control in encounters. The option is nice to have. I don't see us needing it, per se, but maybe we will. Time will tell. So, let's move on to the next item. Now we've talked about basically everything that the job is going to see. How do we envisage the level 90 rotation flow? Because I know that's going to be the big deal for us as the guide writers to, present to players all over. How do you envisage that shaping up?
Well, I think from a macro perspective, it should appear pretty obvious to most players, sort of the roadmap that the job would play out as. As we saw in the job trailer, after each trance duration is finished, it grants you access to each crystal for each of the 3 primals to be used. And so, at least going off that information, of course, that they could always change something between now and the final release. Maybe they don't want you to summon primals every minute, though I think that might be a mistake to change that. But at least with the information we have right now, effectively you're going to be rotating your trance cooldowns every roughly 60 seconds, which is kind of similar to what we have right now. Like, that by itself isn't really changing. But then instead of having these distinct filler phases in between those cooldowns, all of that filler space will be taken up by each of the 3 primals that you'll finish, a Bahamut trance, for example, and then immediately you're going to summon Titan or Ifrit or Garuda, depending on which order you want to work in, and you're just going to chain all 3 of these primals back to back to back, use all of their actions when you can, and then go right into the next trance as that cooldown becomes available. And I think that's just like sort of the way the rotation would play out, given the design.
One thing that I had neglected to mention was so the trances, or rather the summon actions themselves, they're currently on the GCD, and they are affected by spell speed, at least from the footage that we've seen from the demo, where Yoshida's cooldown for them was 58.02 seconds. Now, this does bring the question to mind is, how much is spell speed going to be important for the end rotation, and is it going to be like a highly sought after stat? That is kind of hard to gauge without everything being known in terms of traits and damage numbers, because even if speed, whether it's for melees or whether it's for casters, even if speed results in potential rotation shifts or extra potential gains, it has to be evaluated as, is it still worth it, depending on how much damage is not affected by spell speed. It's kind of nice for a bit of wiggle room, but it might become an illusion of choice thing where, let's say we add more spell speed let's say, the wiggle room was appreciated to mitigate drift, but it might just become a case of, okay, we build to a certain GCD, and we use it on cooldown, which effectively what happened in many cases when it came to rushing in this expansion, and that's definitely something to think about. However, one thing they might do with the summon cooldowns is they stealth nerf Eggy Assaults and Shadowbringers, where before Eggy Assaults used to have their recast adjust with your spell speed. So in theory, if you had high spell speed, you could gain more Ruin 4s per time. They hard nerfed that. They stealth nerfed that so that spell speed didn't affect it anymore. So it was strictly 30 seconds, even though it was a GCD, or on the GCD. Now, they could do that with the summons. They might not. That's something we'll have to see on release. And it might open up some ideas. It might open up some, fight-specific GCDs. We'll have to wait and see with that. I wonder what the rest of you think with regards to the 90 rotation, now that we effectively have 4 distinct phases.
I think as far as spell speed goes, it'll probably be encounter-specific. I imagine we still have a bit too much damage in our off GCDs as a percentage of our damage, so if we can get an extra Demi out because we reduce the cooldown enough in an encounter, that could be worth it. So I think it'll be dependent on the tier.
And it also matters, I guess, which Demi, because with Bahamut you get Death Flare and Phoenix you don't, so there is a slight damage difference.
There's also the consideration that going faster reverse drifts us out of buffs, and so even if we're gaining stuff, is it worth it, right? We're not putting as much stuff into our team's buff, then our off's weak enough now that it's worth it giving it away. So it's just really hard to tell.
I think it's interesting though, because as we are observing, buffs are having quite a long duration, so maybe that idea of alignment desync is not going to be necessarily as big of a deal. Maybe we'll have some high value actions not be in the windows if we're doing so, but maybe that doesn't even matter, especially if we have buffs that are lasting for 20-30 seconds, because that's,
Yeah. Or maybe the primal phases just do so much damage relative that it's fine. It seems like the emphasis of bursting only in Demi is maybe being lowered a little bit. So maybe when we see the damage that you could shove into a Titan phase, for example, or whichever one you want to choose, is high enough to compare.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to think about what exactly our burst window is, because it's like, okay, is it the demi phase? Is it like the end of the demi into the first primal? Is it certain primal windows back to back? It's figuring out, because we don't have all the potency numbers yet, so it's really hard to evaluate that. But it's kind of crazy for me to think that we might have like an opener situation, which obviously, we can't escape out of the Bahamut trance, so we have that in mind. But if buffs are really long, then effectively what could be classed as like the first opener buff window could also be thought of as a very long window. I think it's definitely interesting to see the direction taken, and I'm curious to see what counts as Summoner's Best Burst, and it might be, the end of Bahamut into Garuda for AoE. It might be the end of Bahamut into whatever's best for single target. And then we have the weird things that are always going to be on, a strict cooldown with the minute interval with energy drain. But we do have that flexibility of when to use Ruin 4 because it has the minute-long buff timer. And so I don't think we've ever had as many options for how to play the job as we do now. I don't know if that's something you agree or disagree with, but it feels like that to me the more I think about it.
I had a comment on like the spell speed thing.
Mm-hmm.
It is worrying, like let's say you're using our 2-minute buff on like the 2 GCDs or GCD before you go into your first Bahamut window, and your spell speed, like with YoshiP, it was like 58 point something seconds on his cooldown.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean like 2 minutes down the line, your buff is now delayed into like you can't use it anymore because if you're rushing, you'll be locked out. So that would mean every single window after that for the next, I don't know how long it would take for you to overcome the delay. I mean, it would just delay every single buff window for the rest of the encounter. So that could be like a major consideration, I think.
That's very true.
Because it's not like now we have a 3-minute cooldown, and so by the time we get to our second usage, we're ahead enough where it's not impacting it too much. But with the 2-minute and our alignment being pretty strict, that I think it would be it'd be problematic.
That's a very good point, and it would lead to like a hard drift in that regard, especially as if we're catching up more and more. So it might have to be the case that we still want to avoid spell speed, very much so, especially if we want to keep aligned for the sake of the party. Now, while it is a smaller percentage, obviously we still want to maximize the potential uses and not just lose an outright use from a given time window because Bahamut or Phoenix are blocking the situation. It's definitely something to mull about and see how that plays out. So the next section really I wanted to discuss is it's a snapshot of level 90 play, what we've seen in the trailer and what we've seen in the demonstration from Ishida. We don't know necessarily how things are going to pan out in the leveling up situation. Some things will be fairly simple to think about, but the whole situation with the trances or the summons and the primals, for like the capstones are summon X2. So does that mean we have a summon X1 equivalent? Do we have like a weaker version at earlier levels? What do you think about the leveling experience moving away and into Endwalker?
I think it would be hard to make it worse than it is right now. But it's pretty bad right now. But it really depends what level they put this stuff on. I think we could see that like one of the gem skills was level 26, if correct me if I'm wrong, or something like that, which kind of implies that we have a way to use that skill at that level, which means that they probably are giving us some way of giving like a summon or ether before then.
Yes, level 26 for gem brilliance, the AoE equivalent. So maybe that's when we get both.
It could be, and then like we reset those by using trances. It wouldn't really make sense for us not to have a way to reset those. Not the gem shine, but the summon, like Garuda, Ifrit, Titan. So like my guess is that it's just going to be carbuncle themed, and then they're going to tie it into like the current job quests at like 30, 35, and 45 in the main story, to have like trait upgrades to reflect the primals, and then I think they're just going to continue augmenting them with a billion traits as you level up.
That definitely seems plausible to me, especially when we consider that the like Gemshine actions, at least in the build currently, is Ruby, Emerald, Topaz, right after the gem names for the carbuncles that we're able to have, and currently Eggy Glamour too. So I know you're probably excited that there's more love for Ruby in the core job rotation, Adis.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, who isn't? If you're not, I'm going to be very upset.
But that is probably the way that they're going to go, because if we're getting the gem abilities that early, then clearly we must, because the first summoner quest happens at 30, right? And it's from then onwards that we're eventually getting, Ifrit, Titan, Garuda. And whether that's still adhering to like the quest that we did at level, 35, 40, 45 to get the Eggies, maybe that's when the Gemshine actions will also start like upgrading, and maybe that's when we'll get Summon Garuda 1, Summon Titan 1, and Summon Ifrit 1. That would make most sense to keep in line with the lore, and also just to not make the whole job sequencing be a bit of a nightmare, where if it just traits into better versions rather than here at this level you suddenly have to change your entire rotation because of one thing, and it's like, oh god, that's what makes it really hard for newer players, where they're like, what, I have to change what I'm doing again and again. And Summoner and Black Mage have definitely been quite bad offenders for that, especially for AoE. So maybe it is much more streamlined as a leveling experience, so it'll be interesting to see that.
It's also going to be interesting to see if they, I think I mentioned this earlier, see if they go back and like change any of the writing or lore for any of it, because it is pretty significantly different. Like the gem stuff, for example, right? Like it's mentioned in the Arcanist lore, right? That like you fashion carbuncles from gems and how they're all related, but like it's not a major part of the lore as it pertains to Summoner, right? So I'm kind of curious to see if they will do anything with that, and they'll incorporate it anyway.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they're going to do any retcons, or if the gem stuff is going to be level 80 to 90 lore.
It would be interesting. I know that they're kind of averse from having to edit and update the older quests. The only times where they've had to do that is when the job quests were literally impossible to complete because old actions didn't exist anymore. Like Hotshot or Leeches, suddenly Machinist and Scholar couldn't do anything and they had to wait until that was fixed. So they might just keep the same ideas. Maybe, actually, they don't have to retcon the Eggy side of things, because what if Summon Garuda 1, Summon Titan 1, and Summon Ifrit 1, instead of the the elemental primal forms, what if it's just the Eggy forms? So they're the things that appear briefly. Like, I could definitely see that being the case. Hopefully the leveling up experience isn't too troublesome, and I do hope that in practice it is streamlined, because a lot of people are suddenly excited for Summoner for Endwalker. A lot of people have been saying Summoner 1, the job actions trailer, and personally, in many ways, I agree with that sentiment. We had by far the longest trailer. We had a demo sequence with Yoshida finally playing Summoner in a producer live letter. That's never happened before. And not only that, it was very Summoner thematic with all of the soundtrack that was playing as he was doing the demos. It's definitely a good time to be a Summoner, or want to be a Summoner for sure. So there's one other aspect we wanted to touch on, and that is, how do we feel that Summoner will be in learning encounters and in progressing in raids? Because I know that's an aspect that's important to a fair number of us.
Very strong. I mean, even this expansion, I considered Summoner like one of the absolute best jobs in Prog, because having the personal shield with Earth and Armor, it's such a strong combination when you combine the fact that Summoner is a race caster. and what that utility allows you to do with regards to recovery, being able to raise down party members, especially if they're healers, or just helping your healers recover from situations. The combination of both of those two utility skills is just exceedingly strong. And the fact that the shield will still exist, of course, it's nerfed, technically speaking, compared to what we have right now. With Earth and Armor being 30% max HP right now, and Endwalker, it's going to be a 20% max HP shield, but you still get the benefit of having personal survivability. Also, if Physic is ever changed to actually scale from intelligence, which is what we're sort of anticipating, since they actually kept that skill in the game, because I can't imagine why else they would keep it in the first place. So if Physic is also going to get the Verkeer treatment and actually scale from intelligence, then you're now combining having a personal shield versus survivability now with a heal ability on the GCD that can also technically help you with survivability. And then you also have Firebird Trance now providing two different heal effects. The first one, which is Everlasting Flight, which already exists currently in the game. And everyone knows that it's an AoE regen effect. But then the second heal action from Phoenix, which is initially an on-application just AoE heal, sort of like a weak Medica, so to speak. But then that also applies a buff that sort of works like an Xcog effect when you translate the tooltip, which states that upon reaching a certain HP threshold, or when the buff disappears, you will then gain a second AoE regen for another 15 seconds, and that AoE regen was significantly stronger compared to the Everlasting Flight.
More than double.
Effect. Yeah. So there's a lot of healing in Summoner's Kit, which for a DPS job is definitely insane. And, like I said, combining the personal survivability of the shield and caster rays still existing with the job, it's going to be a very, very strong job in progression.
Oh, for sure.
The only real demerit seems to be the lack of cast reduction in trances. So it is harder to compete with like Red Mage's output of chain raising, but I mean Red Mage can't raise if it's dead, right? Like the existence of shielding is so important, and the extra like party utility from the healing is really strong as well.
Yeah. And I'm also a little bit worried about how they're going to deal with like a summoner's damage output because of all those prog strengths and the mobility. But we'll just have to see how they balance the potency going forward.
Yeah, I can't help but feel that Summoner is going to be taxed a lot more because, it's super mobile, survivable, has raise, has strong other utilities. That's a lot to offer. So I feel like Summoner might be getting more of the Red Mage treatment where it's no longer a top-tier DPS as it was at certain points in the past two expansions.
I do kind of expect that it would be around Red Mage's level of output, and then, naturally Black Mage should, all things being balanced, probably be above both of them.
Like, both Summoner and Red Mage right now are in, like, a very, very good spot. Like, even if Black Mage is theoretically higher, Summoner and Red Mage are still solid jobs. So it's like, I'm not expecting that, like, suddenly their damage output would be so low that it would actually be a problem.
Yeah,
I doubt it.
Like in 5.0?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what caused that. I don't know if that was just like a balancing issue or what they were thinking there.
I hope it doesn't repeat. I really hope it doesn't, because that is certainly something that's always in the back of my mind, where with all of these proc strengths that we have, yes, we're very safe, but if there's a gulf between like the damage potential, like there needs to be a gap. But if it's so much so that
you can't clear
exactly, because it can be a possibility.
Well, they don't always get balanced right the first time, but they are pretty good at getting to it eventually. And I would be shocked if like at the latest X.1, like 6.1, they don't have that more or less ironed out.
Yeah, I feel like the balance will probably be quite good by the time the Dragon Song War Ultimate rolls around.
Yeah.
I hope so as well, because my hope is that, all jobs will play decently, not have like really awful clunk, and the damage profiles are sensible, where, when we noticed that, yes, Summoner and several other jobs, in fact, 6 of the DPS jobs in total were doing quite low damage versus the 4 that were doing really good damage back in 5.0. When 5.1 hit, we were the ones who were immediately saying, hey, look, Summoner's doing too much damage now, and Summoner did need to have its damage toned down to be more in line with what is effectively now a much more balanced state. And I hope we don't have more repeats of that. I'd hope Square have learned their lesson, where don't have a low, weak release into God tier into nerf every patch. Like, if it's weaker, then maybe like small adjustments would be better, but they can be like heavy-handed in terms of the future changes, and then they have to like chip away. Maybe that's easier for them to do, I can't claim to know. But they do have a lot of math models for everything, and they should have a good grasp of the damage potential of jobs. So I'm hoping that, it's closer, but there's enough of a difference with the more synergistic and prog-friendly jobs, versus the jobs that are much more selfish in terms of the amount of damage output they're doing. So like Machinist, Black Mage, and the Samurai as very notable examples. So that's something that I hope, is done well. But are there any other thoughts in a prog scenario that we might have for what we're looking forward to?
The mobility is also going to be very nice, and that's also been like a recurring theme, that Summoner having a lot of mobility, it makes prog a lot less stressful when you're playing the job, because you don't have to think about always maintaining cast up time like if you were playing Black Mage or even Red Mage to an extent. You always had that on-demand mobility with the Ruin 2 if you just had to use it. And so with, again, Summoner having really strong mobility in this expansion, I think, again, in prog, it's going to feel very easy from that perspective, that you don't have to worry about uptime or standing still for casting or things like that. You really could just like move around freely for the most part. And so that will also play a part in terms of the prog straight there for sure.
It's like something like 80% instant cast, and then you also have your R3 1.5 second duration or cast time. So it's just, chances are even if there is a mechanic, you'll just be able to handle it freely, even if you don't know it's coming, unless you're in like Ifrit or something.
Kind of like a second phys range, sort of. So probably going to be doing a lot more, who knows, baiting mechanics, who knows. My group was joking that I'm going to be doing all the phys range mechanics now instead.
Yeah, with the personal shield. That's
Machinist.
Like, oh, you can go bait super jump down or something.
Yeah, you can be really far away from your healers.
I'm just thinking that instead, with a new Machinist, the Machinist is the new like caster, where Machinist might have more of these like melee ranged actions with chainsaw or whatever, or the shotgun, and they have to be more of the melee roll or something like that. I'm just thinking with Fizz range now, the memes come true.
Can't even use Bahamut. I'm in Bahamut, I can't move as an example.
Yeah.
That'd actually be really awkward, like if Machinist does in fact have to do that, because you would then have both of your range jobs having to be in melee range at certain points, because you have Ifrit with the dash.
I'm an Ifrit. Cut bait, I'm an Ifrit.
Yeah. You get to control it though, right? So if your group says, that doesn't work as an excuse, you could just do Ifrit.
Yeah, you can just like take turns with your Machinist, like you line up. It's my
line
turn
up your
now.
Primals. Yeah, you take your turn on the line. It's your turn to bait super jump. No, it's your
Now it's your turn. One thing I hope with Ifrit at least is that after you use the gem action, which grants you the Crimson Strike or Crimson Cyclone rather, is ready. I hope that, let's say we cast that and suddenly we have to do like a baiting mechanic. Obviously we can't do the dash in, so I'm hoping that using a different action, whether it's like Ruin 4, whether it's Ruin 3, that it doesn't interrupt the combo, so to speak, that we still retain the buff so that we can resolve the mechanic safely, then do the melee dash. Because I think us having a gap closer is crazy. We were the only caster that didn't have effectively an emergency movement measure when you consider like between the lines, ethereal manipulation, core, and a displacement. Like our equivalent of that was sprint. I guess that's why Scholar has the buff sprint now. But but the fact is that I'm hoping that is an option where we don't have to suddenly confine Ifrit, where it's Ifrit action into immediate gap closer, where there is the option that we can still do some ranged mechanics and then do the gap closer. At least that's my wish with that. Maybe that's not the case, but we'll see soon enough.
Yeah, if we can plan it out, might be quite nice for certain mechanics.
So it's definitely been a good talk. Definitely longer than we were planning and anticipating, but we've been very thorough in talking about what we're looking forward to. I suppose one quick mention to correct something I said in error before. Adel isn't the same as it was, or as it is right now, where Adel now across the state, across the board for casters, also reduces physical damage by 5%. And so that's nice for bosses where after a raid, while they're doing autos, it just makes the healing a little easier. I highly doubt that we'll have a situation where a boss is only doing physical stuff for a long time, but that situation may pop up. It existed with Sephiroth in the past with Tiferet. If it happens again, then we have a 5% physical damage down, and that's definitely useful across the board for cast. It's not summoner specific, but anything that helps make healers' lives easier is a net plus for prog and safety. But yeah, so let's start to close on this. Are there any thoughts you'd like to end on with regards to what you've seen for Endwalker Summoner? Let's start with you, Ellie.
Really, I just hope that they release the job in a functional state. If you've been playing Summoner for a long time, then you are no stranger to Square Enix's previous attempts to rework this job for new expansions and how that's always kind of turned out in retrospect. So I hope that this time around they do things correctly and make the job a much smoother experience from the get-go and not have to do another mid-expansion rework. Other than that, like I said, with adding the new primals and things that they're doing, like visually, the job is definitely an improvement in that regard. And also removing the pet AI system that pretty much all of us have complained about for years is probably one of the best changes they ever could have made for this job. Finally allowing the pet actions to sort of be infused by your character and you're the one casting them. That's certainly just going to make the experience of the job infinitely better, not having to deal with pet AI shenanigans any longer. So in that regard, like that's going to be such a great change. But yeah, I just hope that they do things, they balance things properly the first time around, and we don't have to repeat the mistakes of Stormblooded Shadowbringers.
How about yourself, Adis?
I'm really excited to play Summoner. I think thematically it looks sick. I'll say maybe if they were to add more off GCDs, perhaps in the future, likely it'd probably be the next expansion. I think it would round the job out quite nicely. So yeah, as Ellie said, hope it is well balanced upon release. We don't have to go through some misery in that aspect. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Looks like it'll be a lot of fun. And I also do appreciate having more party utility. I think that kind of stuff is always very useful. But yeah.
How about yourself, Hidar?
I hope that next to hiding Gemshine, Yoshido is also hiding like another 2 or 3 OGCDs in the demonstration. Without it, would make the job more. They would give you more to do with all the weave space you have, but I'm not too hopeful.
And how about yourself, Litsy?
I'd say overall I'm pretty happy with it. I kind of echoing what's been said before. I'm excited to play it. I think it will feel better than it does right now. A lot of the complexity of current summoner is kind of bogged down into unintended interactions and jank and annoyances that a lot of players really don't like, although some people do. I am a little concerned that it looks like it's going to feel a little too simple and bare bones, but we don't really have enough information to say for sure. So I'm kind of in the same boat of just like really hoping that they expand on the OGCD area, maybe reduce the energy drain cooldown, or have something else to go with that to make it feel a little bit busier, because it feels like it's not going to have as much going on. And that's really my only wish list for it. I'm pretty excited for it.
And how about yourself, Spence?
I think, well, personal opinion is that it's the right direction for the job, and while I am sad that there's less pet interaction, because that's always been something I've liked about the job, I'm happy that the pet AI is not going to be as much of a problem, at least what it seems, and I think people will appreciate that, or I hope they do, and that's definitely been frustrating, so I'm happy that it'll be just a little bit more easier to play for most people, and yeah, and I'm excited for it.
I guess it's time to also give my thoughts and feelings of where things are heading. I think it's really nice, as you've all touched on, where the pet AI problems are going to be more of a thing of the past. There's probably going to be a few left with the demis. I mean, we did notice that Phoenix, when it was out, didn't move when Yoshida moved away. Now, granted, with Bahamut, he just stood by Bahamut the entire time, but with Phoenix just kept on doing the Scarlet Flames. I know that's been a point of frustration for a lot of players. It's like, why is my pet moving all the time? Why am I like ghosting? And there will still be some cases where we can ghost things, but you know, with some good practices, it's not going to be as big of an issue as some of the causes with pet AI currently are. And Pet's no longer doing autos, or rather, Carbuncle not doing autos is quite important to that end. It's only something really that's going to be a thing with the Demi Primals. I'm really excited that effectively a lot of our woes have been solved with this shift towards VFX actions that come from the summoner directly. They're taking note and giving, you know, things more to the summoner, and that helps mitigate any of the pet-related problems, because pet AI has been one of the worst things the job has had to endure for a really long time. So seeing us move away from that, I think, is good. And I also do echo the sentiments, though, about the OGCD play. Is hoping there's more to it. Otherwise, it might feel that whilst there is complexity in the choice of what to do when, the actual pacing might feel a little slow at times. Although I do feel in the elemental primal states that with their stack actions being faster than your regular GCD, that's going to help with the pacing feel side of things. But as a whole, I'm really, really excited for Summoner finally feeling more like a summoner for once, and how it's going to just fit into the grand scheme of things for solo play, group play, and raids. I think it's a really exciting time to be a summoner, and I'm finally really happy to see this kind of thing unfold. And if the job plays well out of the bag, that'll be the first time that's ever happened in a very long time. And that's all I really want. Numbers are easy to fix. A job being bad in how it plays is not. And I want to have faith that designers have learned a lot from the mistakes of the past, and is hoping that it is a good expansion to be a summoner on release. So with that all said, it's time to say goodbye, and I'd like to thank the members of the summoner team that have been with us for all this time. Thank you very much, everyone, for giving your opinions and thoughts. And to all of you who have stuck through to the end and in listening to our rambles, have a good Akhmorning. Thank you.